Minister, almost 480,000 people in our state received the pandemic unemployment payment yesterday. That's over 480,000 people who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own. For every one of those workers, while their outgoings and their bills remain the same, some are even higher because they are spending more time at home. In many cases, their income has been reduced. And the only new message from this government for those people on the PUP who have lost their jobs, the only new message from your government is that they'll be receiving a tax bill. That's all they've heard from this government. And in some cases, that tax bill will be up to €1,400. Last autumn, I carried out a survey in relation to household debt. And over 300 people of the respondents shared their stories with me. And this is what some of them told me. Lost all of my work and struggling to pay household bills. Had to borrow money to pay some bills. Unable to manage higher bills like electric, and now coming into winter fuel costs, as on a lower income with PUP. Now looking at services that can be cut. Shopping on a weekly basis is gone, as we don't have it, as bills come first. I'm trying to keep things together for the sake of my family. I cry most nights going to bed, so my son and husband don't see how much of a toll it is taking. Both of us are out of work. The price of utility bills keeps rising. I had to take unpaid leave from work, as creches couldn't take my baby. So we are struggling now with just one income. This is the real-life reality for people on the pandemic unemployment payment today. And your response in your amendment to this motion is that you're getting the PUP, then you talk about the fuel allowance and the household benefits, the very payments that these people on the PUP are not getting, hence the entire purpose of this motion. You then go on to speak about the North, and it reminds me of when I was in primary school, probably in junior or senior infants, and I was arguing with a girl in my class about which one of our fathers had more cattle and going through how many animals each of us had. I spoke to my friend last night in the north of Ireland. She lives there with her partner. They pay about €5 a week in electricity, and they wouldn't be skimping on it. Her car tax costs £20 a year. You cannot compare fuel costs in the north of Ireland with down here. There's no comparison. The cost of living down here is extortionate for families and for those who have lost their jobs. And it turns my stomach to see comparisons made to the north of Ireland, where last week our minister introduced COVID heating payments, one-off payments of £200 to people struggling in fuel poverty in the north of Ireland. That is what we are doing. And in down here, you're offering nothing new in this motion in your amendment at all. And what we are asking for in relation to this motion is action from government. And that means a double payment for 2 weeks in February, as has been done before when we've had extremely cold weather. It's not impossible, it's been done. It'll cost £20 million. It will not break the bank. We're looking for a proper budget for the exceptional needs payment, which you constantly say is an option for people. Of course, we know it is an awful lot harder now to get to your community welfare officer, and we also know that not everyone is comfortable going down through that route, and there's always discretion when it comes to the community welfare officer, so there was no guarantee of payment. I've asked you several times in relation to the 15-month rule. If I lose my job tomorrow, I get nothing as regards fuel assistance for 15 months. Twice you said you've looked at that, and I've got nothing back. I'm asking for that rule to be suspended, temporarily suspended, for these people who are losing their jobs and in some cases losing everything they've ever had in relation to work. I've asked you to extend the fuel allowance to PUP recipients. There's a few weeks of the fuel allowance left. Yes, it might be extended. It is a measure you can take tomorrow to help these workers and their families. And I'm asking you to introduce a discretionary fund of €5 million. This is not an ask from me or Sinn Féin. This is an ask from the National One-Parent Family Alliance. You and your government think you are doing enough. Spark, One Family, St Vincent de Paul, Focus Ireland, 10 organisations who are on the ground and who are helping people day in or day out. They beg to differ, and they're saying what's there is not enough. And that is the message that I am getting across to you today. It is not enough, because government is about choices, and you choose to pay super junior ministers increases. You choose to give the head of the Department of Health an increase. And what you should be choosing is to help these families who are struggling in the midst of a global pandemic. And your message in this amendment is nothing. It's nothing new, just a tax bill, nothing more. Gur Mahagat.
First of all, I want to commend my colleague Claire Curran for bringing this bill to the floor of the Dáil, a very reasonable bill with practical solutions which would dramatically improve the lives of so many. Fuel poverty means that people literally do not have the ability to afford to heat their homes for them and their families. Families choose between putting food on the table, heating their homes or paying bills. Now, we have the fuel allowance, but there's clear evidence that in its current formation it simply does not go far enough, because despite this allowance, the reality is that many still can't afford to meet their heating needs, and in their absolute desperation they have to turn to charities like St Vincent de Paul, who will pay for deliveries of oil or coal or pay their electricity bill. But this should not be happening. The state should ensure its citizens do not experience cold due to affordability. Heating is a basic need and it is life critical. And I spoke to one carer in Galway City who assists many people elderly people across the city, and the very difficult and upsetting reality is that a lot of elderly people that she calls to stay in one room in the house, usually the kitchen, for the entirety of the day until they go to bed, because they simply can't afford to pay to heat the rest of the house. And I'm sure we can all think of elderly friends, neighbours and relatives who do this. And even more shockingly, she told me that some elderly people stay in the bed until the afternoon, when the afternoon carer comes, because they don't have the ability to keep the fire going all day. And some of them even decline to have a shower because the house is so cold. I mean, how horrendous is that? And this obviously has a knock-on effect. People staying in beds reduces their mobility and increases chances of sores. And it's not just the elderly that this is affecting. Another woman told me that she can only pay for one bag of coal a week, which means that she can only light the fire in the afternoon. That means that she wakes up in the cold. At a time when we're asking people to stay at home, she wakes up to a cold house, has to stay and wait in a cold house until she can turn on the heat, simply because she's on a low income. Another woman told me that this winter, for the very first time, she has to go to moneylenders to pay to heat her home. But we can do something about this, and this bill does something about this. It makes sense to extend the fuel allowance to PUP recipients. It makes sense to suspend the requirement of being in receipt for 15 months of job seekers' payments, and it makes sense to make a double payment of the fuel allowance to all existing recipients for 2 weeks in February. So let's all come together on this and support Claire's bill and improve the lives of so many people across our communities.
It says a lot about where we are when in one breath we're discussing an 80,000 salary top-up for a public servant worker, and in the next we're talking about other workers around North Kildare who can't afford to light their home, cook a meal or turn on the heating. We've swapped the metaphorical cold house of the mother and baby homes for the literal cold house, where working families and our elderly wear their coats indoors or go to bed early simply to keep warm. Behind closed doors, our people are struggling with their emotional and mental health because of the extended lockdowns. In Kildare, we're on our 4th lockdown, Minister, hunkering down for the long haul, too many of us doing it in the cold. Imagine watching your children miserable, not able to be comfortable because they're too cold. Imagine being an older citizen, unable now to sit on the bus or the train to keep warm and save a couple of hours of heating because they can't do it now because they're isolating at home. Imagine how disempowering this is for parents and pensioners. This is not our tenement society of the last century. This is a successful society where luxury city pads lie empty while our tent cities are full, and working families in my constituency in North Kildare are grateful for the dark because nobody sees the St Vincent de Paul man coming. A successful society where there's money to burn on state overruns, where people with asthma, COPD and bronchitis suffer aggravations because of the cold of their home. And still, more suffer cold-induced stress, anxiety and depression. Our plan would bring them in from the cold, literally, in the way that it matters. I commend my comrade Deputy Claire Curran and her PMB, because we believe in a shared human dignity. We believe we live in each other's shelter, not in their shadow. Just think of the 475,000 people in receipt of the PUP last year, so many in my own constituency. I know from them how impossible it is to heat and eat on that money in the middle of the winter, in the middle of a pandemic. We're proposing anybody on the PUP would also get the fuel allowance and a double payment of that allowance for a fortnight in February. Crucially, we're calling on you, Minister, to set up an initial discretionary COVID fund of €5 million to help thousands of households with utility bills and in arrears. These debts are not just a social poison, they're a human degradation that social justice activists have long been warning about. The handling of COVID-19 is laying bare all the fault lines in our society. It's stripping away the veneer of our compassion. We're quarantining our people in the cold, and we must do better. And with this motion, we can.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. Minister, this motion is looking for fair play. And time and again, your government says that the opposition doesn't come forward with solutions. And of course, we do come forward with solutions. The problem is you don't like them, and you don't listen, and you don't act. And your party has no regard whatsoever for what I would consider to be fair play. Because if you did, you would support this motion, Minister. There are two central asks to this motion which I think should be accepted and implemented by the government. One is that the fuel payment itself, the allowance, the payment would be doubled for the month of February. And the second is that all of those on the pandemic unemployment payment, those 480,000 workers who lost their jobs temporarily, or some of them maybe for longer, through no fault of their own, are given access to the fuel allowance payment. And your answer to that question, Minister, is no. And I've said to you and to many of your colleagues time and again in this chamber that Fine Gael, in my view, represents a cosseted, privileged class. And you don't like it, Minister, when it's said, but the reality is it's true. And the reason why you don't like it is because it is true. And you don't have any defence to that argument. Three of your colleagues in government, three senior ministers, sat down a number of weeks ago and they hatched a plan between the three of them to pay one senior civil servant a pay increase of €81,000, an amount that many people on the front line in hospitals will never see as a salary. And this isn't a salary for that one individual, it's a pay increase of €81,000. And three senior government ministers sat down, hatched that plan, and even up as late as yesterday were defending it with that L'Oreal-type comment, because they're worth it. And yet when it comes to giving ordinary workers and families a bit of a break and to give them access to the fuel allowance because they're staying at home longer, because their children are not in school, they have to heat their homes, they're struggling to pay bills, what does the minister say? No. Again, it's no from the government, because you represent that cosseted privileged class. Your priority is for those people in the upper echelons of society. And you see, when it comes to those who need the support the most, it doesn't happen. And I think it's a disgrace, Minister, that again, on an issue as important as this, when we are trying to ensure that people are given supports and families are given adequate supports to pay bills, basic bills like heating their homes, that your response to that again is no, and I think it's shameful.
Circuit Clerk.
Minister, as of last week, there were over 12,000 people in my constituency of Longford Westmeath in receipt of the pandemic unemployment payment. And the vast majority of those 12,000 workers and families have never needed social welfare supports before, and do so now solely because of this pandemic. The struggle to keep a warm roof over their heads is very, very real, and so is the growing energy debt as they struggle to meet the cost of keeping their homes warm. And I want to highlight the case of one family to you. Dad is a tradesman, and Mum works in the home caring for their small young children. An average hard-working family who've always managed to keep their heads above water until this pandemic struck and Dad was laid off. For the first time ever, they couldn't even afford their rent. This family and countless others have survived this winter by begging and borrowing from friends, family and charities. Initially, the CWO refused an exceptional needs payments for this family, and eventually they were given a one-off payment to provide heat for a single week. They found themselves in the unprecedented and deeply distressful position of having to choose whether to spend their last €10 on food or on electricity. That week, food won. That week, they sat in the kitchen around the oven for heat while it cooked. This situation is not an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a wider, very real lived experiences of people who are in very real need of urgent support. Minister, I'm calling on you to not only heed the concerns heard here today, concerns echoed by the likes of Bernardo, St Vincent de Paul and Flack, but to act on those concerns. Extend the fuel allowance for workers in receipt of the pandemic unemployment payment. Suspend the 15-month qualifying exclusion period for job seekers and provide the double week payment for 2 weeks in February. A properly funded scheme for exceptional needs payments will assist not only those on the pandemic unemployment payment, but others that are fighting fuel poverty on an ongoing basis this year. Minister, this payment is called exceptional needs. We are absolutely living in exceptional times, and these measures are absolutely needed now.
Brian Stanley.
Thanks, Ascan Corley. Families have been hit very hard with this latest lockdown. It's been a very difficult year for families across the Midlands and across the country who lost their jobs and are facing significant drop in income through no fault of their own. In the case of Laois, Offaly and Kildare, this is actually the fourth lockdown, Minister. Currently, there are 475,000 people in the state on the PUP payment, pandemic unemployment payment, 6,838 of those in Laois, 6,707 in Offaly. The reality behind these figures are families struggling to pay bills, to put food on the table and to pay for daily essentials. The Sinn Féin motion is aimed at providing some relief for these families. Our motion will amend the fuel allowance scheme to provide financial support for heating costs to all families on the pandemic unemployment payment. We're also calling for the double week payment of fuel allowance for 2 weeks to be paid to the existing claimants and to PUP payments in February. And this is really needed for the reasons that have been outlined here this morning. So this means that workers who lost their jobs over the course of the pandemic and are on a pandemic unemployment payment will not be excluded from the fuel allowance scheme. Households in the Midlands must also contend with the cessation of peat harvesting. Many families would have bought turf plots, and right across Laois, Offaly, this is an issue, and the government has to address it. Many families who did buy turf plots in previous years from Bordnamona and saved that turf themselves, they now have no alternative source of fuel, and they haven't got any other means except that, and haven't had that up to now. What they must do now is buy much costlier solid fuel for heating and cooking, and that's causing real problems. They must also face a second year running of an increase in carbon tax pushed through by your government, by Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens. And what's interesting here is that what we're asking for is very modest. And just a few weeks ago, while the Christmas holidays was going on, and just after that, €81,000, 81,000 of a pay rise, not of a salary, 81,000 on top of 211,000 of a pay rise was sanctioned for a new Secretary-General, whoever gets the job in the Health Department. And that just shows you we need to try and address some of this imbalance, Minister. So what these families need is an alternative source of fuel. What families across the state need is some financial support here. The Minister also must confirm the situation around the moratorium on gas and electricity disconnections. The CRU announced in early January that we're introducing a new moratorium until the 31st of January. The Minister must now ensure that that moratorium is kept in place and won't be discontinued until we're out the far side of the pandemic. And I want the Minister to revert back to me on that. It's really important that people have food and heat and shelter There's so many people this morning that don't have a home. There's so many people this morning who don't have heating for their home. There's so many people this morning who don't have enough to eat. There's people who are trying to make an enormous juggle, and they have debts coming in because some of the banks aren't listening in relation to the so-called break in mortgages. So what we're asking you here for is financial relief to make sure that people can keep warm till we get out the far side of this pandemic.
Humphreys.
And I move the amendment